January 1787, and a massive ship is sinking in Plymouth Harbor. The HMS Dutton, a 64-gun ship of the line, is going down fast. But this isn't just any naval disaster. Below deck, hundreds of convicts are trapped, shackled in chains, screaming as freezing water rushes in around them. The crew has already fled. Every sailor who could save himself has abandoned ship. The convicts can't move, can't swim, can't escape. They're going to drown like animals in a cage, and everyone knows it. On the shore, a young naval lieutenant hears the chaos. Edward Pellew is 29 years old, on leave, with absolutely no obligation to get involved. These aren't his men. This isn't his ship. And those prisoners? Society has already condemned them. They're criminals being transported to Australia. Nobody would blame him for walking away, but Pellew doesn't walk away. He commandeers a small boat and rows out through dangerous, churning water toward a ship that's breaking apart. He climbs aboard a vessel that could capsize at any moment. He goes below deck into flooding holds where the water is already chest-deep and rising. The stench is overwhelming. The screaming is deafening. The danger is absolute. Pellew finds an axe, and he starts smashing chains, one convict, then another, then another. He drags them through the freezing water, hauls them up to the deck where rescue boats can reach them. He goes back down, again and again, and again. He doesn't stop until every single person who can be saved is off that dying ship. When it's over, dozens of lives have been saved because one man made a choice. Not the easy choice, not the safe choice, not the choice that would win him medals or promotion. Just the right choice. That single moment tells you everything you need to know about Admiral Edward Pellew, 1st Viscount Exmouth, the man who would become one of Britain's most brilliant naval commanders. The officer his contemporaries called the most naturally gifted seaman who ever lived. The admiral whose final mission would free thousands of enslaved people and change the course of history. And yet, his name has been almost completely forgotten. Welcome to the story of Britain's most brilliant admiral you've never heard of. When people think of British naval heroes, certain names immediately come to mind. Horatio Nelson, of course. Maybe Francis Drake or James Cook. If you're really into naval history, perhaps Collingwood or Hood. These are the legends, the names carved into monuments, taught in schools, celebrated in films and books. But here's what most people don't know. While Nelson was winning his famous victories, there was another admiral whose career was just as remarkable, whose tactical innovations were just as important, and whose humanitarian achievements were arguably more significant. His name was Edward Pellew, and the fact that you probably don't recognize it is one of history's greatest oversights. Pellew's record speaks for itself. Over a 40-year career, he never lost a ship under his command. Never. In an era when maritime disasters were common and battle losses expected, Pellew brought every vessel home. He captured or destroyed over 50 enemy warships. He revolutionized frigate tactics and ship handling, techniques that became standard practice throughout the Royal Navy. He commanded in every major naval theater of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. But his achievements went far beyond tactical brilliance. In 1816, he led one of the most audacious naval operations of the entire 19th century, bombarding the city of Algiers and forcing the Dey to release over 1,000 Christian slaves and abolish white slavery entirely in his territories. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a humanitarian triumph that freed thousands of people from bondage. His fellow officers revered him. The common sailors adored him. The French feared him. He was mentioned in dispatches more times than almost any other captain of his era. He rose from modest origins to become a peer of the realm, based purely on merit and achievement. So why don't we know his name? Why does Nelson get the monuments, the films, the national celebrations, while Pellew barely rates a footnote in most history books? The answer to that question reveals something fascinating about how history is remembered, who gets celebrated, and what kinds of achievement last in public memory. But before we explore why he was forgotten, we need to understand who he was. And that story begins in 1757 in Dover, with a boy born into a family that had seen better days. Edward Pellew was born on April 19, 1757, into a world where your family name determined your destiny. The Pellews were an old Cornish family, the kind with lineage and history but very little money. His father, Samuel Pellew, was a commander in the packet service. Respectable naval work, but far from the prestigious postings that led to wealth and advancement. This background would define Edward's entire career. He wasn't born into aristocracy with guaranteed success. He didn't have powerful relatives who could secure him easy promotions or lucrative positions. Everything he would achieve, every rank he would earn, every battle he would win, he would have to fight for himself. And fight he did, starting from the very beginning. At 13 years old in 1770, Edward entered the Royal Navy as a midshipman aboard HMS Juno, a frigate bound for the Mediterranean. If you think 13 seems absurdly young to send a child to war, you're absolutely right by modern standards. But in the 18th century Royal Navy, this was completely normal. Boys entered service as young as 12, sometimes even younger if they had the right connections. The theory was that seamanship couldn't be taught from books. It had to be learned through brutal, direct experience. So these boys were thrown into the deep end of naval life. They scrubbed decks until their hands cracked and bled. They hauled on ropes in freezing rain and burning sun. They climbed masts that swayed violently in howling gales, 100 feet above a deck that was itself pitching on massive waves. They learned navigation by doing it, learned gunnery by firing cannons, learned command by watching officers make life and death decisions every single day. It was sink or swim. Literally, many boys didn't make it. Some died from disease, falls, or enemy action. Others simply couldn't handle the physical and mental demands and were quietly returned to shore. But some thrived, and Edward Pellew didn't just thrive, he excelled in ways that stunned his superior officers. He possessed something that couldn't be taught. An almost supernatural gift for understanding ships and the sea. Other midshipmen struggled to master the complex mathematics of navigation or the intricate choreography of working a sailing vessel. They had to think through every decision, calculate every angle, memorize every procedure. Pellew seemed to know instinctively. He understood how a ship would respond to wind and current before he gave the order. He could read weather patterns in the sky and predict storms hours before they hit. He knew where enemy ships would position themselves in battle, when to crowd on more sail to gain speed, and when to reef in to maintain control. His hands and eyes and mind all worked together with a natural fluency that other officers spent decades trying to develop. His superiors noticed immediately. Captain John Pownall, who commanded HMS Juno, took a particular interest in the young midshipman. Pownall became more than just a commanding officer. He became a mentor, a protector, and something close to a second father. He gave Pellew opportunities to learn, pushed him to develop his skills, and advocated for his advancement. This wasn't just another gentleman's son playing at Navy life, marking time until he inherited an estate. This was a natural. This was someone special, and everyone who served with young Edward Pellew knew it. But natural talent alone doesn't make a great commander. That requires testing. That requires hardship. That requires being forged in fire. And in 1775, that fire was about to arrive in the form of war with America. In 1775, tensions between Britain and its American colonies exploded into open warfare. For the Royal Navy, this meant a new kind of conflict, one that would test officers in ways the traditional battles against France and Spain never had. Pellew found himself serving in North American waters aboard HMS Blonde, still under the command of Captain Pownall. The American Revolutionary War wasn't about massive fleet actions or line-of-battle slugfests. Instead, the Navy faced a frustrating, dangerous kind of warfare that demanded different skills entirely. They hunted fast American privateers through treacherous coastal waters where local knowledge mattered more than firepower. They supported army operations along a hostile coast where every inlet could hide an ambush. They maintained supply lines across 3,000 miles of ocean while enemy raiders tried to cut them. They fought in fog and storms and uncharted channels where a single navigation error could wreck your ship more effectively than any enemy cannon. It was warfare that rewarded initiative, quick thinking, and aggressive seamanship. All three were Pellew's natural strengths. While other officers hesitated, worried about violating standing orders or risking their ships, Pellew learned to trust his instincts and act decisively. Captain Pownall encouraged this, giving his protege more and more responsibility, letting him make tactical decisions that would normally be reserved for much senior officers. Pellew was learning the art of independent command, the kind of warfare where there were no admirals to give you orders, no fleet to support you, just your ship and your crew against whatever challenges appeared. He was learning to read situations quickly, make decisions with incomplete information, and commit fully to his chosen course of action. These lessons would shape his entire approach to naval warfare. Then came 1778, and the moment that would mark him forever. HMS Blonde engaged the American frigate Ranger off the coast of Ireland. It should have been a straightforward action. The British ship was more powerful, better armed, and had a highly experienced crew. But the Ranger was commanded by John Paul Jones, one of the most brilliant and aggressive naval commanders America ever produced. Jones didn't fight by the rules. He didn't do what British captains expected. He was unpredictable, innovative, and absolutely fearless. The battle was fierce. Ships locked together, crews firing at point-blank range, smoke everywhere, men screaming, wood splintering under the impact of iron shot. And in the middle of this chaos, Captain Pownall was killed on his own quarterdeck, cut down by enemy fire. For 21-year-old Edward Pellew, this wasn't just the loss of a commanding officer. This was the death of his mentor, his protector, the man who had shaped his entire career. The man who believed in him when others saw just another midshipman. The man who had become like a father to him. The grief was crushing, immediate and overwhelming. But there was no time for grief. The battle was still raging. The ship still needed to be fought. Men were still dying. The enemy was still there, guns blazing, trying to kill everyone aboard. Pellew fought on. He helped work the ship through the engagement even as officers fell around him. He fired guns. He directed men. He did whatever was needed to keep his ship fighting. The action ended inconclusively. Neither side could claim a clear victory, but it marked Pellew in ways that went far beyond the physical battle. He had seen what happened when you hesitated in combat, when your tactics were predictable, when you gave a clever, aggressive enemy room to maneuver and think. Jones had fought in ways that British captains didn't expect, and it had nearly worked. That lesson burned itself into Pellew's mind. Be unpredictable. Be aggressive. Never give your enemy time to think or react. Strike fast, strike hard, and strike where they least expect it. Don't fight by rules that your opponent might not follow. Do what works, not what's conventional. And above all, never underestimate an enemy just because they're supposed to be inferior. These principles would guide Pellew through every battle of his career. They would make him one of the most feared and effective frigate commanders in the Royal Navy. And they would keep him alive through decades of combat when so many of his contemporaries died. But first, he had to survive the long, frustrating years of peacetime service, where talent alone wasn't enough and advancement came at a glacial pace. The end of the American War in 1783 should have been good news for British naval officers. Peace at last. No more battles, no more casualties, time to recover and rebuild. But for ambitious young officers like Edward Pellew, peace was the worst thing that could happen to a career. The Royal Navy shrank dramatically in peacetime. Ships were decommissioned and placed in ordinary, basically mothballed in harbor. Crews were paid off and dispersed. Officers were placed on half pay with no ships to command and no way to distinguish themselves. Promotion ground to a halt because there were no battles to create opportunities, no victories to win recognition, no way to show what you were capable of. Pellew continued to serve when positions were available, but advancement was maddeningly slow. He was talented, yes. He was recognized as exceptionally skilled, absolutely. But talent without opportunity means nothing in a system where advancement requires active service and notable achievements. Without war, there were neither. This is where many promising officers lost their edge, spending years on half pay, waiting for postings that might never come, watching less talented but better connected officers leap past them through family influence. Some became bitter, some left the service entirely, some took up drinking or gambling to fill the empty years. Pellew did none of these things. Instead, he used the time to become even more capable. When he had a ship, he drilled his crews relentlessly. He studied navigation, gunnery, tactics, ship handling. He read everything he could about naval warfare. He learned from every captain he served under, adopting what worked and discarding what didn't. He was building a comprehensive understanding of his profession that went far beyond seamanship. He was learning leadership, how to inspire loyalty in common sailors, how to maintain discipline without cruelty, how to get maximum performance from a crew, how to make men want to follow you, not just because they had to, but because they believed in you. And then came that January day in 1787 that we opened this story with: HMS Dutton sinking in Plymouth Harbor, convicts trapped and drowning, everyone else abandoning ship, and Pellew making the choice that would define his reputation among the common sailors of the Royal Navy. He didn't have to risk his life for those prisoners. They were criminals, condemned by courts, being transported to Australia for their crimes. Society had already thrown them away. Nobody expected a naval officer to care about their lives. But Pellew went anyway. He smashed their chains, dragged them to safety, made trip after trip into a sinking ship until every person who could be saved was off. The story spread through the Navy like wildfire. Among the officer class, reactions were mixed. Some thought him foolish for risking his life unnecessarily. Some thought it was beneath an officer's dignity to exert himself for convicts. But among the common sailors, the reaction was unanimous. They loved him for it. They understood something profound that the officers missed. This was a captain who saw them as human beings, not just expendable tools. This was an officer who would risk himself to save people that society considered worthless. Which meant if they were ever in danger, if their ship was sinking, if they were wounded in battle, if they were captured by the enemy, this man would move heaven and earth to bring them home. That reputation would serve Pellew extraordinarily well in the years to come. Sailors would compete to serve under him. They would follow his orders without hesitation. They would fight harder and sail better for him than for any other captain. Because they knew he valued their lives, that he wouldn't spend them cheaply, and that loyalty ran both directions. By 1793, when war with revolutionary France finally broke out, Edward Pellew was ready. He had the skills, the experience, the reputation, and the mindset. All he needed was opportunity, and the French Revolutionary Wars were about to provide opportunities beyond anything he could have imagined. When war with revolutionary France exploded in 1793, the Royal Navy needed aggressive, capable frigate commanders who could hunt enemy commerce, gather intelligence, and wreak havoc along hostile coasts. Edward Pellew was exactly what they needed, and he was about to prove it spectacularly. He was given command of HMS Nymph, a 36-gun frigate. For Pellew, this wasn't just another posting. This was his chance to show everything he'd learned, everything he'd practiced, everything he'd prepared for during those long peacetime years. And he didn't waste a single moment. Within weeks of taking command, Pellew encountered the French frigate Cléopâtre off Start Point. It was June 1793, and this would be the first single-ship action between British and French frigates of the war. The pressure was immense. Britain needed a victory, needed proof that the Royal Navy was still superior, needed to set the tone for the entire conflict. Pellew delivered. The battle was brutal and decisive. He closed to point-blank range, exactly the kind of aggressive tactics he'd developed over decades. His gunnery was devastating. His crew, drilled relentlessly in peacetime, performed flawlessly under fire. Within an hour, Cléopâtre was captured, her captain killed, her crew surrendered. It was a complete victory that sent shockwaves through both navies. For Britain, it was proof that the Royal Navy had lost none of its fighting edge. For France, it was a warning that their revolutionary fervor wouldn't compensate for inferior training and tactics. And for Pellew, it was validation. Everything he believed about aggressive action, superior gunnery, and confident seamanship had just been proven in the most public way possible. But he was just getting started. Over the next 6 years, commanding first Nymph and then HMS Indefatigable, Pellew became the terror of the French coast. He didn't just patrol and wait for targets to appear. He hunted. He took his frigate into dangerous waters where most captains wouldn't dare venture. He raided harbors, cut out ships from undershore batteries, and chased French vessels with relentless determination. His ship handling was legendary. Other captains would see dangerous rocks or shoal waters and back off. Pellew would study the charts, calculate the tides and currents, and take his ship through passages that seemed impossible. He understood that aggressive action often meant going where the enemy thought you couldn't go, appearing where you weren't expected, and striking before defenses could respond. In January 1797, Pellew achieved one of the most spectacular victories of his career. His squadron, including Indefatigable and HMS Amazon, encountered the French ship of the line Droit de l'Homme off the coast of Brittany. This wasn't a frigate. This was a 74-gun warship, vastly more powerful than anything Pellew commanded. The conventional wisdom said frigates didn't engage ships of the line. It was suicide. Pellew attacked anyway. For hours through a storm-tossed night, his 2 frigates harassed the massive French warship. They used their superior maneuverability to stay out of the worst of the ship of the line's broadside while maintaining a constant fire. They aimed for rigging and sails, trying to cripple the bigger ship's mobility. They gave the French no rest, no chance to organize a decisive response. By dawn, all 3 ships were being driven toward the coast by storm winds. The sea was massive, visibility terrible, navigation nearly impossible. This was when seamanship mattered most, when years of experience and natural talent made the difference between survival and destruction. Droit de l'Homme, damaged and unable to maneuver effectively, was driven onto rocks and wrecked. Over 1,000 French sailors drowned or were captured. Amazon, also damaged, was lost on the shoals. But Pellew brought Indefatigable through impossible conditions to safety, saving his ship and crew through sheer skill and determination. It was the kind of victory that becomes legend. A frigate captain taking on a ship of the line and winning, not through superior force, but through superior tactics, seamanship, and sheer aggressive determination. The French had learned to fear the name Pellew. British sailors wanted to serve under him, and the Admiralty recognized they had one of the finest frigate commanders in the entire Royal Navy. Throughout these years, Pellew also demonstrated the humanitarian principles that had driven him since the Dutton rescue. He treated prisoners well, ensuring they received medical care and decent conditions. He went out of his way to rescue enemy sailors from drowning ships. He protected civilian vessels from violence. This wasn't softness. Pellew could be utterly ruthless in combat, but it was principle. War was about defeating the enemy, not about cruelty for its own sake. His crews noticed. They saw a captain who fought ferociously but acted honorably, who demanded excellence but treated men fairly, who risked his ship in battle but never wasted lives unnecessarily. This combination of professional competence and moral leadership created loyalty that went far beyond normal naval discipline. By 1799, Pellew had captured or destroyed over 30 enemy vessels. He had established himself as one of the premier frigate commanders of the age. He had demonstrated tactics and techniques that other captains studied and imitated. And he was about to be promoted to flag rank, where his influence would expand from commanding a single ship to shaping entire squadrons and naval operations. But before we follow him into those higher commands, we need to understand the foundation of everything he achieved. We need to return to that moment in Plymouth Harbor and understand what the Dutton rescue really meant. Now that you understand who Pellew became, let's return to that sinking ship in 1787 with new eyes. Because the Dutton rescue wasn't just a dramatic moment, it was the foundation of everything that made Pellew extraordinary as a commander. Think about what that choice revealed. Pellew was off duty, under no obligation to act. The convicts were strangers, criminals that society had condemned. There were no medals waiting for saving prisoners. No promotion boards would be impressed. No admirals would write commendations. This was pure moral choice with no external reward, and yet he acted. Not because he had to, not because it would benefit him, but because it was right. This wasn't how most 18th century naval officers thought. The Royal Navy was a brutal institution. Discipline was maintained through flogging. Sailors were often pressed into service against their will. Officers came from the upper classes and saw common sailors as fundamentally different kinds of human beings. The idea that an officer would risk his life for convicts, people even lower on the social hierarchy than common sailors, was almost incomprehensible to many of Pellew's contemporaries. But Pellew saw it differently. He saw human beings in mortal danger. He saw people who could be saved if someone acted. He saw a situation where his skills and courage could make the difference between life and death for dozens of people. And that was enough. That was all the reason he needed. The impact of this choice rippled through his entire career. Sailors talk. Stories spread through the fleet faster than any official dispatch. Within weeks, every sailor in Plymouth knew about the officer who had risked everything to save convicts. Within months, the story had spread throughout the Royal Navy, and it fundamentally changed how common sailors viewed Edward Pellew. They knew he saw them as human beings. They knew he valued their lives. They knew that if their ship went down, if they were wounded in battle, if they faced any danger, this officer would do everything in his power to save them. That knowledge created a kind of loyalty that no amount of discipline or hierarchy could manufacture. When Pellew commanded a ship, he got the best from his crews not through fear but through genuine mutual respect. His sailors worked harder, fought more fiercely, and performed more skillfully because they wanted to, not just because they had to. They trusted him completely because he had demonstrated through action, not just words, that their lives mattered to him. This was revolutionary leadership in an era when most officers relied on harsh discipline and class hierarchy. Pellew proved that treating men with basic human dignity and showing genuine care for their welfare actually made them more effective, not less. He demonstrated that moral leadership and tactical excellence weren't contradictory, they were complementary. The Dutton rescue also revealed Pellew's courage, but not the kind of courage that gets celebrated in battle. This was moral courage, the courage to do what's right even when it's inconvenient, dangerous, and offers no obvious reward. The courage to act on principle even when nobody would blame you for walking away. This same moral courage would define the greatest achievement of his career, because decades later, Pellew would face another impossible choice. Another situation where he could walk away or risk everything. Another moment when he would have to decide whether some human lives were worth saving, even if those lives belonged to people that society had written off. That moment would come in 1816. Off the coast of North Africa, in a city called Algiers, and it would be the defining mission of his entire life. Promotion to Rear Admiral in 1804 should have meant the end of Pellew's days of personal action. Flag officers commanded squadrons from flagships, managed strategy, and left the actual fighting to their captains. They became administrators more than warriors. For many aggressive frigate commanders, promotion to flag rank meant the end of the excitement that had defined their careers. Pellew refused to accept that transition. He took command of the North Sea Squadron and then the East Indies Station. But he didn't settle into comfortable routine. Instead, he used his new authority to implement the lessons he'd learned over 3 decades of active service. He wasn't just commanding ships anymore, he was shaping how the Royal Navy operated. His first focus was gunnery. Pellew had always believed that superior gunnery was the key to naval victory. Not just having guns, but being able to fire them faster, more accurately and more effectively than your enemy. He had drilled his own crews relentlessly in this skill, but now he could mandate it across entire squadrons. He implemented systematic gunnery practice throughout his command. Ships had to conduct regular live fire exercises. Captains had to submit reports on their crew's performance. Gun crews were timed and evaluated. Officers who couldn't meet Pellew's standards were replaced. It was demanding, exhausting, and sometimes resented by captains who preferred easier routines. But it worked. Ships under Pellew's command became noticeably more effective in action. Their rate of fire increased. Their accuracy improved. When they engaged enemy vessels, they won faster and with fewer casualties. Other squadron commanders noticed and began adopting similar training regimens. Pellew's methods became standard practice throughout the Royal Navy. He also revolutionized ship maintenance and crew welfare. Pellew understood something that many admirals missed: the connection between taking care of your men and getting optimal performance from them. He ensured that ships under his command were properly supplied with fresh food whenever possible, reducing the scurvy and malnutrition that plagued many vessels. He advocated for better medical care and established protocols for treating sick and wounded sailors. He also insisted on fair treatment of crews. Flogging remained part of naval discipline. This was still the 18th century. But Pellew discouraged excessive or arbitrary punishment. He believed that respect and fair treatment produced better sailors than fear and brutality. Captains who relied on harsh discipline to maintain order found themselves answering to an admiral who wanted to know why their leadership required so much violence. This wasn't sentimental softness. Pellew remained a demanding commander who expected excellence and didn't tolerate incompetence or cowardice. But he proved that you could maintain high standards and strict discipline while still treating men as human beings deserving of basic dignity. Ships under his command had better morale, lower desertion rates, and fewer discipline problems than comparable vessels. Perhaps most importantly, Pellew used his flag rank to advocate for professional merit over social connections in officer promotion. He had risen through talent alone, without wealthy family or aristocratic connections, and he believed the Navy should reward capability rather than birth. He promoted officers based on their performance in action, their seamanship skills, and their leadership abilities, not their family names or social connections. This wasn't popular with the establishment. Many senior admirals and politicians believed that officer ranks should be reserved for gentlemen. That command was as much about class as competence. Pellew's insistence on meritocracy was seen as radical, even dangerous. But he had the record to back up his position. The officers he promoted consistently performed well. The captains he recommended distinguished themselves in action. Results spoke louder than prejudice. By 1814, as the Napoleonic Wars wound toward conclusion, Pellew had been promoted to vice admiral and commanded the Mediterranean fleet. He was 57 years old, had been at sea for over 40 years, and had earned the right to a comfortable retirement. He had achieved everything a naval officer could aspire to: wealth, titles, honors, and respect throughout the service. But the most important mission of his career was still ahead of him. A mission that wouldn't be about defeating enemy warships or protecting British commerce. A mission that would be about human freedom and the moral courage to act when others wouldn't. A mission to a place called Algiers, where thousands of people were living in slavery, waiting for someone to care enough to save them. That someone would be Edward Pellew, and what he did there would become his greatest legacy. In 1816, the Napoleonic Wars were over. Europe was at peace. The Royal Navy had won command of the seas, and Britain stood as the world's dominant maritime power. For most admirals, this was time to relax, enjoy peacetime postings, and collect their honors. But Edward Pellew, now Viscount Exmouth, had one more battle to fight. And this one wouldn't be about British interests or naval supremacy. It would be about something more fundamental: human freedom. For centuries, the Barbary states of North Africa, particularly Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, had engaged in what was essentially state-sponsored piracy and slavery. They captured ships in the Mediterranean, enslaved the crews, and held them for ransom. European powers paid tribute to prevent attacks, essentially bribing the Barbary rulers to leave their ships alone. It was a system built on extortion, terror, and human suffering. Thousands of Europeans languished in slavery in North Africa. Men, women, and children captured from ships or coastal raids, living in brutal conditions, many never to see freedom again. Their families paid ransoms when they could. Diplomatic efforts occasionally freed small numbers. But the fundamental system continued because no European power was willing to use force to end it. Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Exmouth, decided that had to change. The defeat of Napoleon meant Britain could finally spare the naval resources to address this moral outrage. And there was only one admiral with the skill, reputation, and moral authority to lead such a mission: Edward Pellew. The mission was clear, but extraordinarily dangerous. Take a fleet to Algiers, force the Dey to release all Christian slaves, and compel him to abolish slavery in his territories. Do this without starting a wider war, without massacring civilians, but also without backing down. It required overwhelming force, precise execution, and the willingness to follow through on threats. In August 1816, Pellew arrived off Algiers with a powerful fleet, 5 ships of the line, numerous frigates, and smaller vessels. It was an impressive force, but Algiers was heavily fortified with over 1,000 guns positioned in shore batteries. The city's defenses had been designed specifically to repel naval attack. The narrow harbor approach meant ships would have to attack at close range, taking devastating fire from positions they couldn't effectively target. Naval wisdom said attacking heavily fortified shore positions with ships was foolish. Ships were mobile but vulnerable. Shore batteries were static but nearly indestructible. The advantage always went to the defense. Previous attempts to bombard Barbary ports had failed miserably, with ships taking heavy damage while inflicting minimal harm on land fortifications. Pellew knew all this. He had spent his entire career studying naval tactics and understanding the capabilities and limitations of ships. He knew that what he was about to attempt violated conventional naval wisdom. But he also knew something else. That surprise, precision, and overwhelming commitment could overcome theoretical disadvantages. On August 27th, he made his approach. The Dey had refused all diplomatic overtures. Confident his fortifications made him invulnerable. He was about to learn otherwise. Pellew brought his fleet in closer than anyone expected, almost to point-blank range of the shore batteries. This was insanely dangerous. His ships would take massive damage, but it also meant his guns would have maximum effect against the cities, fortifications, and the slave pens where thousands of people were held. The bombardment began at 3 p.m. It was one of the most intense naval actions of the entire 19th century. Over 50,000 shot and shells were fired in the next 9 hours. The shore batteries hammered Pellew's ships with devastating effect. HMS Queen Charlotte, his flagship, took over 600 hits. Other ships were similarly battered, masts shot away, hulls holed, crews decimated by flying splinters and cannon shot. But Pellew's ships gave better than they got. Their gunnery, trained to his exacting standards, was devastatingly accurate. They systematically destroyed battery after battery. They set fire to the city's wooden buildings. They demolished the fortifications that had protected Algiers for generations. And most importantly, they targeted the facilities where slaves were held, demonstrating to the Dey that continued resistance meant the destruction of his entire city. Through the smoke and chaos, Pellew directed the action with the same cool competence he had shown in 100 previous battles. Ships were repositioned as needed. Damaged vessels were pulled out of line and replaced with fresh ones. Fire was concentrated where it would have maximum effect. This wasn't random bombardment. It was a precisely executed operation designed to break the will of the defenders while minimizing unnecessary destruction. By midnight, Algiers was burning, its defenses shattered, and the Dey was facing the total destruction of his city. He sent out messengers seeking terms. Pellew's response was uncompromising. Release all Christian slaves immediately, abolish slavery in Algerian territories, and provide reparations. Accept these terms or the bombardment continues until the city is ashes. The Dey capitulated completely. Within 24 hours, over 1,000 slaves were freed and delivered to Pellew's fleet. Over 3,000 more were released in the following weeks. The Dey agreed to abolish white slavery and pay substantial compensation to European nations whose citizens had been enslaved. Pellew had achieved what centuries of diplomacy and tribute payments had failed to accomplish. He had ended one of the most persistent humanitarian abuses in the Mediterranean. He had freed thousands of people from bondage and prevented thousands more from suffering the same fate. The cost had been significant. British casualties exceeded 800, including over 140 killed. His ships had taken tremendous damage and required months of repairs. But measured against the number of lives freed and the evil ended, Pellew considered it worthwhile. When news reached Britain, the public reaction was euphoric. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a moral triumph. Britain had used its naval power not for conquest or wealth, but to free enslaved people and end a humanitarian atrocity. Pellew was celebrated as a hero, feted throughout Europe and honored by multiple nations whose citizens he had freed. It was the crowning achievement of his career, not his most tactically brilliant action. He had fought more skillful battles as a frigate commander. Not his most dangerous mission. He had faced greater personal risk in dozens of previous actions. But it was his most important, his most consequential, and his most morally significant achievement. Edward Pellew had proven that naval power could serve justice, not just national interest. That military force could free the enslaved, not just conquer enemies. That one determined leader with the moral courage to act could end evils that others had accepted as unchangeable. So we return to the question we started with. Why don't we know Edward Pellew's name? Why does Nelson have monuments across Britain while Pellew barely rates mentions in history books? Why has such an extraordinary career been so thoroughly forgotten? The answer reveals something fascinating about how history is remembered and what kinds of achievement create lasting fame. First, there's the nature of their achievements. Nelson's victories were massive fleet battles: Trafalgar, the Nile, Copenhagen. These were dramatic, decisive actions involving dozens of ships and thousands of men. They could be commemorated with paintings, monuments, and national celebrations. They had clear before and after moments. Britain's strategic situation changed visibly and immediately because of Nelson's victories. Pellew's achievements were more diffuse. Dozens of successful frigate actions, each tactically brilliant but individually less dramatic. Consistent excellence over decades rather than singular moments of triumph. Systematic improvements to naval practice that shaped how the service operated. These are harder to celebrate with monuments. You can't point to a single day and say, everything changed because of what Pellew did here. Even Algiers, his most dramatic achievement, doesn't fit neat celebration patterns. It was a humanitarian mission rather than a strategic victory. It freed slaves rather than defeating a major enemy. It's morally profound but strategically limited. History tends to remember strategic victories over humanitarian triumphs, especially when those triumphs benefit people outside the commemorating nation. Then there's the factor of death. Nelson died at Trafalgar, killed at the moment of his greatest victory. This gave him instant martyrdom and immortality. He became a symbol of sacrifice and triumph, forever frozen at his peak. Pellew lived to 75, retired peacefully, and died in bed surrounded by family. That's obviously better for him personally, but it's less dramatic for posterity. Heroes who die in battle become legends. Heroes who retire comfortably become just historical figures. There's also class and social dynamics. Nelson came from a comfortable background and married into aristocracy. He moved in elite social circles and cultivated powerful patrons. Pellew came from struggling gentry and never had those connections. He earned everything through merit, which is admirable, but it left him with fewer powerful advocates to promote his reputation after death. Victorian historians writing about the Napoleonic era had living descendants of Nelson's friends and allies to consult. Pellew had fewer such champions. The historiography of the Napoleonic Wars also worked against Pellew. Historians focused on the great fleet battles and famous commanders. The frigate war, the commerce raiding, the blockade duty that actually strangled France's economy and made those fleet battles possible. This received far less attention. It was less glamorous, harder to narrate dramatically, and involved too many captains to celebrate individually. Pellew was the master of this less glamorous warfare. He was the professional's professional, admired by fellow officers more than by the general public. When historians wrote popular accounts, they focused on the dramatic moments that made compelling stories, not the grinding daily work of maritime dominance. That's where Pellew excelled, but it doesn't make for popular history. Perhaps most fundamentally, Pellew's story doesn't fit simple narrative categories. He wasn't a tragic hero like Nelson. He wasn't a brilliant strategist whose theories shaped warfare. He was a supremely competent professional who did his job brilliantly for decades without seeking glory for its own sake. He was humanitarian in an era when that wasn't particularly valued. He was cautious about spending lives when the culture celebrated aggressive boldness regardless of cost. His greatness was real, but subtle, and subtlety doesn't create lasting popular fame. We remember simple stories: the hero who died in victory, the genius who revolutionized warfare, the underdog who overcame impossible odds. Pellew's story is more complex, more nuanced, full of contradictions. That makes him a fascinating historical figure, but a difficult popular hero. In the end, maybe it doesn't matter whether the general public remembers his name. His influence was real. His achievements were substantial. His example of moral courage and professional excellence remains valuable. History isn't just about who gets monuments. It's about who actually made a difference. Edward Pellew's story offers lessons that transcend naval history and speak to universal human questions about character, leadership, and what constitutes a meaningful life. The first lesson is about moral courage. Pellew demonstrated repeatedly that doing what's right often means acting when it's inconvenient, dangerous, and offers no obvious reward. Whether rescuing convicts from a sinking ship or bombarding Algiers to free slaves, he chose principle over comfort. This kind of moral courage, acting on conviction when nobody would blame you for walking away, is rarer and more valuable than physical bravery. Second, excellence compounds over time. Pellew didn't become a great admiral through one brilliant action. He became great through decades of consistent professional excellence. Every ship he commanded, every crew he trained, every tactical innovation he implemented built on previous experience. This patience and long-term commitment to craft is a lesson for any field where true mastery requires sustained effort over years. Third, how you treat people when you don't have to reveals your true character. Pellew's humanity toward convicts, prisoners, and common sailors wasn't strategic calculation. It was who he was. And that authenticity created loyalty and trust that no amount of manipulation could manufacture. Leadership based on genuine care for others is more effective and more sustainable than leadership based on fear or self-interest. Fourth, recognition isn't the measure of impact. Pellew's work changed the Royal Navy, freed thousands of slaves, and influenced tactics for generations. These impacts were real whether or not his name appears in history books. The modern obsession with fame and public recognition often obscures the more important question: did your work actually matter? Did you make things better? Did you live according to your values? Finally, history is written by those who tell stories, not necessarily by those who did the most important work. The fact that we don't know Pellew's name isn't a reflection on his achievements. It's a reflection on what kinds of stories our culture chooses to remember and celebrate. Understanding this helps us look past famous names to find the other people who shaped events just as profoundly. Pellew's career demonstrates that an extraordinary life doesn't require fame. It requires competence, courage, and commitment to principles larger than yourself. It means choosing excellence when mediocrity would be easier. It means treating people with dignity when cruelty would be tolerated. It means acting on conviction when calculation would suggest walking away. These lessons remain relevant regardless of whether you're commanding warships or living an ordinary modern life. The principles are the same, the choices are the same, and the impact of living with integrity and excellence is just as real, whether or not anyone remembers your name. Admiral Edward Pellew, 1st Viscount Exmouth, deserves to be remembered, not because he was famous, but because he was exceptional, not because poets wrote about him, but because he genuinely changed the world through courage, skill, and moral conviction. From that freezing January day in Plymouth Harbor when he chose to save convicts nobody else cared about, to that August afternoon off Algiers when he freed thousands of slaves, Pellew demonstrated what leadership looks like when it's grounded in genuine humanity rather than just ambition. His tactical innovations shaped naval warfare for generations. His humanitarian achievements freed thousands from bondage. His example of professional excellence set standards that remain relevant today. The fact that his name faded from memory doesn't diminish any of these accomplishments. History is full of extraordinary people whose names have been forgotten. For every Nelson or Wellington who achieves lasting fame, there are dozens of Pellews whose contributions were equally important but less celebrated. Our job as students of history is to look past the monuments and famous names to find these other stories, to understand these forgotten figures who shaped the world just as profoundly. Edward Pellew's story reminds us that greatness isn't about recognition. It's about choosing to act when action is needed, maintaining excellence when mediocrity would be easier, and treating people with dignity when cruelty would be tolerated. That's a legacy worth celebrating, even if it took us 2 centuries to properly recognize it. If you enjoyed learning about Admiral Edward Pellew and want to discover more forgotten heroes who shaped history, like this video and subscribe. History is filled with incredible stories waiting to be remembered. Let us know in the comments, what other forgotten figures should we cover next?